The auction had been a formality by the time it reached the last parcel on the county list, most of the men who'd shown up that morning already having secured what they came for. Decent bottomland along the river, a stretch of grazing acreage 2 miles out, a modest homestead claim with a working well. And by the time the auctioneer read out the final lot, the crowd had thinned to a handful of stragglers more interested in getting home before dark than in bidding on what everyone in the county had long since written off as worthless ground. The parcel was a stretch of cliffside above a dry wash on the eastern edge of the territory, 300 acres of what looked from any reasonable distance like solid rock and scrub, a place so thoroughly unsuited to farming or ranching that its previous owner had abandoned the claim entirely rather than pay the taxes on it, and the auctioneer, reading the description with a tone that made no effort to disguise his own opinion of its value, seemed almost apologetic offering it up at all. When the bidding opened at $10, a laugh went through what remained of the crowd, the kind of laugh reserved for jokes rather than genuine transactions, and it was into that laughter that a quiet woman near the back of the gathering raised her hand and said that she would take it at that price. Her name was Ruth Calder, a widow of 34 who had buried her husband the previous winter after 4 hard years of failed wheat crops on land 2 counties over, land that had finally been claimed by the bank when the debts outpaced what the harvests could cover, leaving her with a small wagon, 2 mules, a modest sum of savings she'd managed to keep separate from her husband's failing venture, and a fierce, quiet determination not to end up dependent on relatives who had never much wanted her in the first place. She had heard about the auction through a cousin in town and had come with no particular plan beyond seeing what might be available cheap enough to give her a fresh start, and when she saw the cliffside parcel go up with its rock-bottom opening bid, something in her, not logic exactly, more an instinct she couldn't fully explain even to herself, told her to take it. The auctioneer, faintly bemused, confirmed the sale for $10, and just like that, Ruth Calder became the owner of 300 acres that every man in that county considered worthless. The laughter that had accompanied the sale followed her, in one form or another, for months afterward. When she rode out to see the parcel properly for the first time, a neighboring rancher named Otis Bell, whose own land bordered the wash below the cliffs, rode out to meet her with an expression of barely concealed amusement, informing her, as though she might not have understood what she'd purchased, that the ground up there was mostly solid rock, that nothing worth growing could take root in it, that the previous owner had walked away from the claim specifically because it was unfarmable, and that she'd have done better tossing her $10 into the wash than spending it on land that would never yield her a dime. Ruth thanked him for his concern with a politeness that gave away nothing of what she was actually thinking, and continued exploring the property on her own, walking the cliff face for the better part of that first afternoon, studying the way the rock folded and creased, the way certain sheltered pockets along the southern exposure caught the sun differently than the exposed flats, the way a thin but persistent trickle of water seeped from a crack near the upper reaches of the cliff and ran down through a natural channel before disappearing into the porous rock below. She had grown up, before her marriage, on her grandfather's farm in the hill country of Kentucky, where he had practiced a particular kind of terraced hillside cultivation passed down from his own immigrant parents, coaxing crops out of slopes that flatland farmers would have dismissed entirely, building stone retaining walls by hand to create level growing beds on ground that had no business supporting a garden at all. Ruth had spent countless childhood summers learning this craft at his side. Learning which plants tolerated thin rocky soil and which required deeper beds, learning how to channel and conserve water in country where it did not fall generously, learning the patient, back-breaking work of building productive ground out of what everyone else considered wasteland. She had not thought of these skills in years, had assumed them buried alongside a childhood that felt increasingly distant after the disappointments of her marriage, but standing on that cliffside with its seep of water and its sheltered southern exposure, she felt something old and familiar stir back to life, a recognition that what looked like worthless rock to a wheat farmer or a cattleman might, to someone who understood terrace cultivation, represent something else entirely. She began work that spring, alone at first except for her 12-year-old nephew Danny, whom she'd taken in after his own parents succumbed to a fever the previous year, leaving him without close family beyond his Aunt Ruth. The two of them hauled stone from the wash below, building low retaining walls along the cliff's natural ledges, creating terraced beds that stepped down the rock face in the same pattern her grandfather had taught her, filling each level with soil she and Danny hauled up in sacks from richer ground near the wash. mixed with composted manure she traded labor for with a nearby dairy farmer skeptical enough of her project that he charged her almost nothing, assuming she'd abandon the effort. Within the month, anyway. The work was brutal, her hands blistering and cracking within the first week. Her back aching every night from hauling stone and soil up a slope steep enough to require careful footing even when empty-handed, and there were evenings that first spring when she sat exhausted by the small fire outside the cave dwelling she and Danny had cleared out of a natural hollow in the rock, wondering whether Otis Bell and the rest of the county might not have the right of it after all. But the seep of water, carefully channeled and expanded with additional stonework, proved more reliable than she'd initially dared hope, feeding a small system of pools she built to collect and distribute it evenly across the terraces below. And the southern exposure that had first caught her attention turned out to trap and hold heat in a way that extended the growing season considerably beyond what the surrounding flatland experienced, sheltered as the cliffside garden was from the harsh winds that swept unimpeded across the open country below. By midsummer of that first year, the terraces held a modest but genuinely thriving planting of vegetables: tomatoes, beans, squash, cabbages, root vegetables that did particularly well in the rocky, well-drained soil, along with herbs and flowers that Ruth had always loved and had never had proper ground to grow during her years on the failed wheat farm. She and Danny ate well that first summer in a way neither of them had managed in years, and what surplus the terraces produced, she began carrying into town to sell at a small stand near the general store, vegetables so much fresher and better tended than what most of the struggling flatland farms were producing that summer, given how dry the season had turned, that she found herself with more customers than she could easily supply. Otis Bell and the other skeptics in the county did not immediately revise their opinion of her venture, inclined as people often are to dismiss evidence that contradicts an established judgment, attributing her modest success to beginner's luck or an unusually generous first season rather than any real merit in the approach itself. It was the drought that finally forced the reconsideration, arriving the following summer with a severity that the oldest ranchers in the territory compared to the worst dry spells anyone could remember, months without meaningful rain turning the open range to dust, drying up wells and creeks across the county, killing crops in the field and forcing ranchers to sell off cattle at a fraction of their worth, because there was neither water nor grass enough to keep the herds alive through what promised to be an even harder winter. Otis Bell's own bottomland, considered among the finest in the county precisely because of its proximity to the wash, watched its water table drop so low that his wells ran dry by midsummer, his crops withering in fields that had produced reliably for 15 years, and the desperation that settled over the county that summer was the particular, grinding desperation of people watching a disaster unfold slowly enough that they could see it coming but not quickly enough that anyone could do much to stop it. Ruth Calder's cliffside terraces, meanwhile, continued producing through that terrible summer with a resilience that first puzzled and then began to genuinely astonish her neighbors. The seep that fed her water system, drawing from some deeper aquifer within the rock that the drought had not yet touched, continued flowing steadily even as surface water disappeared across the rest of the county, and the terraced beds themselves, built with careful stonework that retained moisture far more efficiently than open flatland soil exposed directly to sun and wind, required a fraction of the water that conventional farming methods demanded to keep plants alive. She had, without fully realizing it at the time she began the project, built a growing system almost perfectly suited to drought conditions, one that captured and conserved every available drop of water rather than losing it to runoff and evaporation the way open field farming inevitably did. And while the rest of the county's crops failed around her, her cliffside garden continued yielding vegetables in quantities that, by midsummer, had become the primary source of fresh produce for the entire region. The change in how people regarded her came gradually and then all at once, the way such reversals often do. First it was a trickle of customers at her town stand growing into a steady line, people willing to travel considerable distances for vegetables that had simply become unavailable anywhere else in the drought-stricken county. Then it was requests for advice, ranchers and farmers who had spent 2 years dismissing her methods as foolish now riding out to the cliffside to see for themselves how she'd managed what nobody else could, asking careful, humbled questions about her stonework and her water channels, about which crops tolerated the rocky terraces best and how she'd managed the irrigation with so little water available. Otis Bell himself, whose bottomland had produced nothing that terrible summer, and whose cattle herd had been reduced by nearly half through forced sales, made the ride out to Ruth's cliffside in early August, finding her and Danny harvesting tomatoes on the lower terraces, and stood for a long while simply looking at the thriving green terraces stepping down the rock face against the backdrop of cracked, dead earth stretching away below toward his own failed fields, before finally admitting, with the particular difficulty men of his generation had in acknowledging error, that he had been wrong about her, wrong about the land, and wrong in ways that had cost him considerably more than the $10 she'd spent to buy it. Ruth did not gloat over this reversal, though she would have been forgiven for allowing herself some quiet satisfaction after 2 years of condescension and dismissal. Instead, she did something that surprised the county even more than her garden's success had, offering to share both her knowledge and her surplus water with any neighbor willing to do the work of building similar terrace systems on whatever marginal ground they had available, teaching a small but growing number of desperate farmers and ranchers the same techniques her grandfather had taught her, techniques that began, over the following seasons, to transform pockets of previously worthless land throughout the county into productive, drought-resistant gardens that provided a crucial buffer against the increasingly unpredictable weather the region seemed to be experiencing. Otis Bell himself became one of her most devoted students, terracing a rocky slope on his own property that he'd previously considered entirely useless, and the friendship that grew between his family and Ruth's, born out of his initial skepticism and eventual humbled admiration, became one of the sturdiest in the county. His own children eventually learning stonework and terraced cultivation alongside Danny, as though it had always simply been part of how things were done in that part of the territory. The drought broke eventually, as droughts do, but its lasting effect on the county was a permanent shift in how people regarded land and water, a hard-won understanding that the flat, easy bottomland everyone had always prized was not, in fact, the only or even necessarily the best way to build a sustainable living from that particular stretch of earth, and that the rocky, unpromising ground people had spent generations dismissing as worthless might, with the right knowledge and considerable, patient labor, prove more resilient than anyone had imagined. Ruth Calder's cliffside garden became something of a local landmark over the following years, visited by curious travelers and written about, eventually, in an agricultural journal that reached readers considerably beyond the county's own borders, and the $10 purchase that had once been the subject of open ridicule became, instead, the story county old-timers told with a kind of proud amazement to newcomers, the tale of the widow who bought the cliff nobody wanted and turned it, against every expectation, into the very thing that carried her whole community through its hardest season. Danny grew up on that cliffside and eventually took over its management as a young man, expanding the terraces further along the rock face and adding an orchard on a sheltered upper ledge that Ruth herself had identified but never gotten around to developing. And when people asked him, as they often did, how his aunt had known that worthless cliff would prove itself so valuable, he would tell them, with the same quiet certainty Ruth herself might have offered, that she hadn't known anything of the sort with any certainty at all, only that she'd learned long ago from her own grandfather that ground other people gave up on was often simply ground nobody had yet taken the trouble to properly understand, and that patience, careful work, and a willingness to see potential where others saw only rock had always, in the end, been worth considerably more than the $10 it originally cost to prove it.